the situation in the West Asia, which is related to what I want to get, because the first point is what you've written on your website, the latest piece on your website, which is important when it comes to the war in Ukraine. But looking at the situation in the West Asia, Donald Trump is getting back, the blockade is back, the war is back. And what does that mean for Russia and for the ongoing conflict in Ukraine?
Well, there's no direct public discussion of what the current present status is, what meaning it has for Russia. What we see on the Russian side are various signs of escalation of Russian assistance to Iran. For example, a finalization of agreement to start building and expand the rail capacity, pardon me, between Iran and Russia, Russia and Iran, to expand the shipping capacity, to enable Russia to do what it needs to do to demonstrate that on the Iran front, Russia is against the United States escalating war against its ally. Okay, there are some signs of that. On the other hand, there are no signs that the Russian leadership, that's principally President Putin, will make the decisions that follow once you accept, as the Iranian side accepts, that it's impossible to negotiate with the Trump administration. Why do I say that? And taking into account that some commenters on our stream object to my repeating words for emphasis. In the last few hours, President Putin's real spokesman for the United States, Kirill Dmitriev, has been tweeting as he usually does. And what he's done in the last few hours is to publicize that he's been at Baikonur, where the Russian space launching site is, to celebrate that there is a joint US-Russian space team that's just launched into space. And he wants to celebrate that as an example of US-Russian cooperation and collaboration, as if there's no war going on, as if the US isn't escalating at the same time and with as much force as puts the rocket into orbit, the attacks in the Persian Gulf against Iran and against Russia on all fronts, the land front, the sea front, the hinterland, and so on. So you've got basically a completely blind set of statements from Dmitriev saying the US is working with us. We are collaborating with the US. We have these valuable collaborations to protect, as if there's no war going on. This is a sign of complete blindness on the part of Dmitriev. And it's an attempt to influence Putin in the direction of continuing to minimize the extent to which Russia interprets the US behavior. So with signs like that, on top of which Dmitriev continues to blame the Europeans for the escalation in the Ukraine, as if the US is not participating. This is not public opinion in Russia. This is not the view of the general staff. It's not the assessment of the intelligence agencies. Therefore, my quick answer to your question is that there remain seriously divided views now, because what's at stake is very serious. What's at stake is that in order for the Russian side to retrieve escalation control in the war against Ukraine, the United States, and the NATO allies, Putin must do things differently. And let's come to that in a minute.
Yeah. John, we had, one of I don't know if we can call him the most supporter of the war in Ukraine in the U.S. He was Lindsey Graham. He passed away because of what has happened. As you mentioned that in
Yes.
your website, you wrote a piece on what has happened to him, and it was so strange. The rupture of that, you know, it's impossible. It's impossible. Something happening inside the body, a war. It's something so difficult to be ruptured. But after all, when you look at Lindsey Graham and his support, it seems that Donald Trump is going to support the bipartisan resolution that they have in the United States to support the war in Ukraine. He said that he's
Yes,
going to support that.
correct.
it means that they're going to get back, they're going to send whatever they have, and Donald Trump somehow doesn't feel that much of Ukraine impact from Ukraine. So do you think that the death of Lindsey Graham would influence somehow the battlefield, or the calculation on the part of the Trump administration, or the the Ukrainian lobby in the United States, which we know they're powerful in the United States?
The short answer to that's no. You begin with the point about a ruptured aorta as the cause of death of Lindsey Graham. That is a common form of heart attack. It kills very quickly. The statistics show that once the aorta ruptures like that, you bleed to death internally within minutes, and it's next to impossible to save you unless you're already at the hospital, and open heart surgery is possible. I don't doubt, and I've seen no serious Russian commentary that indicates any substantiation for the rumor mongering that there was a Russian trace behind Graham's death. There wasn't. Ruptured aorta is a common form of heart attack. It's more obviously lethal. It was in his case. Removing him, however, doesn't change the consensus between the two parties and between the MAGA constituency within the Republican Party, and let's call it the Vance section of the Republican Party, on escalating the war against Russia. The problem, technically, tactically, is that without Graham, there's one less vote for the Republicans in the Senate. That will be quickly replaced.
I'm not sure because his sister gonna replace him. It's gonna
I'm not an expert on South Carolina politics, if that's what happens. The issue is a bit different. The issue is whether without Graham as the head of the Senate Budget Committee, there'll be any breakdown of the consensus he can build behind funding Trump's increased appropriations requests for his increased spending on both the war in Iran and the war against Russia. I don't see that Graham's removal does anything but remove a noisy advocate of what the Trump administration has already come to. What it does tend to weaken, I suppose, rhetorically in the press, is the split between those who are most keen to escalate war in the Trump administration, led by Stephen Miller, the Deputy Chief of Staff, supported by Rubio, Secretary of State and National Security Advisor, and others. And the faction, we've talked about this factional split in the White House, but with Vance, the Vice President, some generals, and some others who want to strike peaceful accommodations in order to protect the domestic political consensus that supports not only Trump and the Republicans at the midterms, but the Trump succession, which Vance obviously wants to capture, and which he continues to dominate even against the dynastic successor, Donald Trump Jr. So removing Graham removes a voice, a noisy one, a violent one, but it doesn't change the underlying politics, and it doesn't change the votes, and it doesn't change the fundamental consensus with the Democrats to escalate against Iran, escalate against Russia. The sanctions bill, which will now get accelerated support as a quotes memorial to Lindsey Graham, imposes 400% tariffs, penalty tariffs, destruction of all trade with all countries like India, China, and Turkey. They've got to be the principal targets of the new sanctions bill if they trade with Russia in any way. So it toughens up the war at sea. It toughens up the war against all Russian trade and all Iranian trade. That's what that bill does. It allows the president to have more room to negotiate those secondary sanctions, as he has been doing particularly with India. He hasn't yet used them against Turkey or China to the degree he's used them against India. But it also makes it more difficult for the president to use his discretion to do what people like Kirill Dmitriev think he can do, which is discretionary lifting of sanctions against Russia. So the sanctions bill would put in place less discretion for Trump to make sanctions relief to the Russian side and to the Iranian side. And we can see already that's what's happened. And people like on the Russian side who believe in Trump flexibility have been disappointed. The waiver of oil sanctions, secondary oil sanctions against Russia, has not been extended. The waiver for Iran has been removed. So prior to Graham's death, we've seen the beginnings of escalation on the sanctions war. Minus one ruptured aorta makes no difference to the American empire's continued policies, and including those of toughening up its relations with the countries it protects, increasing the cost the empire places on those it protects in order to finance the US cost of war. And financing the US cost of war when the US is escalating is an escalating cost. That's being passed to the allies. Minus Graham, no difference.
John, what is the perception of the Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov on the Ukrainian attacks on Russia? And how did you find it?
Thank you for mentioning that, Nima. It's a very serious statement. I'll just look down and read it. Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, has currently been on a tour of Africa. Here's what he said a few hours back, referring to the escalation of Ukrainian drone war guided by the US, especially satellites and drones operating in Black Sea airspace. The escalation has produced an astonishing number of attacks by Ukrainian drones on Russian shipping in the Sea of Azov. Okay, so what Lavrov is responding to there is this. This is not even piracy, Lavrov has just said, which is what the Ukrainian regime is doing. At least, Lavrov said, pirates rob and take the cargo for themselves. But here, the purpose is just to inflict damage, to intimidate. Pure terrorism, says Lavrov, which manifests itself not only in the Sea of Azov and the Black Sea, by the way, but also on the African continent. Now, if you say that, and continue to say, that the war, that the Ukrainian side, plus the United States, plus the Europeans and NATO allies, is pure terrorism, you are missing a fundamental strategic point. You are trying to say this is a Ukrainian regime goal. It's not a regime goal that's confined to the Ukrainians. It's a US empire goal. It's a US plus NATO allies goal. It's war. War at sea, war in the Russian hinterland, war on the Sea of Azov is matched by war against Russian cargoes moving in the Baltic Sea, the the Channel, the Atlantic, and the Mediterranean. It's war. If it's war, not terrorism, the response must be for Russia to recapture its escalation control of the battlefields, all of them on all fronts. To describe the tanker war escalation as pure terrorism is a fundamental strategic mistake, but it's not a mistake because the general staff says otherwise. The intelligence agencies' assessments say otherwise. Public opinion says otherwise. So the response to pure terrorism is not what President Putin has just said yesterday. I'll come to that in a minute. What it is a requirement to escalate on all fronts. But President Putin and the foreign minister now echoing him refuse to do it. Let me give you a very simple example. Oleg Tsarov, who's a Ukrainian opposition figure and a very articulate spokesman for common sense and the way in which, let's call it the expert public opinion, thinks in Moscow, writing on a Telegram account, which he does every day. And I recommend our listeners take a look at Oleg Tsarov, Tsarev, always in Russian, easy to capture in English using an automatic English translation machine. He said a few hours ago, we can completely calmly close the skies for American and British drones and planes over the Black Sea so that they do not share data with the Ukraine. But we don't do that. For this, everything is there. You only need to make a political decision. What's Tsarov saying here? As politely, as courteously, and as in political terms, he's saying it requires the decision of President Putin himself to say that if we are to respond to this escalation of war, which you've just mentioned, we don't respond to it as terrorism by the Ukraine. We attack the methods that these attackers are using, which include every form of guidance flying in Black Sea airspace. But as we know, President Putin refuses to allow the Russian Air Force to down even drones, a position which the Iranian side and the Houthis in Yemen have not adopted. They've not declared the attacks on them to be pure terrorism. They've declared them to be attacks of war. But here's what President Putin said yesterday at an election rally. And I'll just quote it, look down, pardon me, in order to read the words. Victory will undoubtedly be ours, said the president. Our guys, the fighters, are moving forward. He's referring to the land war. And indeed, the Russian forces are moving forward westward. Here's the key quotes. Our responses will always be mirrored. Wherever they try to strike at the territory of Russia, we will respond in a mirror, several times more powerfully. The enemy will feel it. He already feels it. I hope he feels it. And he will feel it several times more powerfully. In other words, President Putin is reiterating, despite all the persuasion that's been applied behind closed doors in the last few days, that Russian response to these attacks will be mirrored, symmetrical, tit for tat, trust in Trump. And this reflects not a fundamental strategic mistake. President Putin can hear Oleg Tsarov's complaint. He simply refuses to adopt that position. By not adopting that escalation and treating the other side as if it's a war alliance, He's encouraging more escalation. So when President Putin says the enemy will feel it, he already feels it, I hope, and will now feel it several times more powerfully. That's not happening. Why? As we've said here, as most of our colleagues say on your show, Nima, what the Ukrainian people feel is irrelevant to the US empire's war against Russia. And Putin has admitted it himself, it's a war to the last Ukrainian. And when there are no more Ukrainians that can be dragooned and press ganged into fighting on the fronts will fall back westward. But what will remain is a war platform, a firing platform on Ukrainian territory by the Allies against Russia forever, if necessary. So it doesn't matter what the Ukrainians feel. That's a mistake. It's what the US feels that counts. Now, you said something very important, Nima. You've said that in connection with Graham's disappearance, unregrettable disappearance, that the US voter going to the polls shortly in expressing that sentiment through senators and congressmen do not feel pain from the war in Europe. In fact, they could be persuaded by President Trump that he's bringing in more money than ever before, certainly compared to the Biden administration, in terms of European procurement of US weapons. The military-industrial complex is getting richer. The US banks in New York have just announced record quarterly profits from the wars. To suggest that the US is losing the war is not an apprehension on the part of the US banks. It's not an apprehension on the part of the US military-industrial complex. And US voters are not feeling pain. Therefore, they can go on funding, go on ignoring the war in Europe. That has to be either an opportunity for the Russian side to reassess its notion that they're dealing with pure terrorism. It's an opportunity to figure out what can Russia do that Iran is doing to inflict pain on US voters, to remind them that these wars they are funding, that they are voting for the Trump candidates to escalate, these wars cost them. Therefore, they should have a second thought about funding it. These are fundamental political strategic questions which the Russian side refuses to discuss in public.
John, to clarify, you've mentioned that the Russia doesn't let, the Russian politician or the Vladimir Putin doesn't let the Russian army hit the drones that coming from Ukraine. You mean those drones coming from Ukraine, the United States, Europeans, whoever is sending those drones? You're talking about the Black Sea. You're not talking about the drones that Ukrainians are sending deep into Russia.
Well, I'm talking about both. Let's just say,
you're talking about reconnaissance drones.
Yes, we're talking about all the forms of reconnaissance which enable, guide the Ukrainian drone attacks. Whether the drone attacks, I'm treating the Sea of Azov as a hinterland for Russia. It is. Okay, we're talking about the hinterland as far eastward as the Omsk refinery. We have a clear declaration from the Ukrainian side, from the US side, from the late Lindsey Graham, that the object of the war is to destroy Russia's ability to produce and to trade. This is a fundamental war aim. It's not terrorism, not to mitigate what terrorism means. It's a fundamental war aim to destroy the base, the economic base of Russia. And that requires US satellite intelligence. It requires US and NATO, British in particular, drone surveillance and guidance, because the drone movements are guided in real time by real intelligence feeds from the US NATO sources. Others are more expert on how this is done in a military sense. I'm discussing it in a political sense. What are the political implications?